Well, it's a very interesting morning, isn't it? The day after, or a few days after, I guess, an incident where the world has a real chance to learn about what is fear and what is fearlessness. And that's my thing. I'm Dr. R. Michael Fisher, back again to do another video on this theme of how do we do a really powerful fear analysis in the world and world events. So that's what's up for today. The event that I want to do a fear analysis of briefly is that there was a young man at a march with the Catholic young boys. You may have seen it on Twitter, YouTube, the whole circuit of social media. It's now become viral. And this young man, 16 so years old, with his group of another 200 or so of these young Catholic white boys, apparently quite angered and excited as well, full of adrenaline. And they were being challenged by various activist groups in the streets of Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And this is connected to, they were there, the Catholic boys, apparently to protest the pro-lifers and the women's movement march, and then there's an Indigenous march at the same time on Washington in that area. Without going into the fine details of that story, because you can look it up, I just watched a small clip off of Democracy Now!, read a few pieces off the internet because I was interested in this particular viral clip, which media loves to attach and interpret and make a big deal of. And in a way, it is a big deal that this young boy stood up to and stood in front of, quote, attempting to stop by standing in front of somebody who happened to be an Indigenous person playing his drum and chanting a prayer that had to do with the American Indian movement prayer and their both spiritual prayer of love and giving from the Creator, and also a prayer that is resistant and shows the resistance and strength and unity of all human souls, and yet at the same time has to be resistance to certain players, powers, politics in the anti-Indian movements that were long going on since colonialism in this country, talking about North America, but it could be in many parts of the world. So here we have this young man playing out the white settler, the white colonialist, and people are arguing, well, does he stand for white supremacy? Does he stand for this? Does he stand for that? And all of that big debate that goes on and worth reading. And then to ask the question that I ask is where I invite you to join a conversation, perhaps that will get us a little further on. So an emancipatory way further. Not just good story, good media hype, good fear mongering, good let's make everybody watch this, and a lot of media people are going to make a lot of money off of it. Yeah, I'm skeptical of media. I'm skeptical of short discourses of activists and politicians and on both sides of the fence and all the different various stripes who I find interpretations in some sense quite unuseful from the perspective of someone who does fear analysis. So this, where I begin, is something I started with a long time ago, was this question: what happens when fear meets fearlessness? I believe this encounter between this young man, the 16-year-old white privileged young person, and an Indigenous elder who was moving into that crowd, not because he was wanting to disturb them, he was wanting to bring some peace and harmony into the tension that they had with, as I say, this other activist group of Black Israelites, apparently, and activists that were also stirring up a lot of hate mongering, fear mongering. But everybody got caught into it. This Indigenous elder, it's interesting to listen to his interviews. He got caught into it in a way too. He even said he felt very afraid. He felt very afraid for the young Indigenous peoples that he was with, that he thought they could be attacked at any time because they're people of color. They're not just people of color, they're a marginalized group. They are classically, historically suppressed, and a group that's been under genocidal attack, arguably, for 500 plus years in America. What happens when fear meets fearlessness? So this young man, as we start the analysis on that question, looks like, as he had his 200 peers wearing their red hats that sort of represent Trump and his politics, make America great. This young man at some point somehow decided he was going to lead this protest against the protest. And he approaches and stands in front of the Indigenous person so he cannot move through. And the Indigenous elder just kept playing the drum and singing in his native tongue. In interviews, he says he was terrified of what was going on. And at the same time, I'm watching this and I'm going, okay, is this not a great example for the world to see in the viral media world of a young person looking extremely brave, smirk on his face, whatever, perhaps his nervousness, but a lot of adrenaline and a lot of backup. They outnumbered these small handful of Indigenous protesters, and they're all full of their school pride, energy, white pride, probably. And you could just see it was a fascinating standoff, a standoff that represents symbolically many battles between the settler white colonialist and the Indigenous people who are from this land and who have been under attack, and for many, as I say, hundreds of years. Was this young man brave? Was he courageous? Was he practicing fearlessness? Was he fearless? That's where I start my questions. So let's take a little analysis of his position, and I'll speak in a moment to the Indigenous persons from what I've heard and seen. All of this analysis being speculative, being hypothetical, but also grounded in a lot of thought and theory and thinking, philosophy that I've crafted and many others have crafted, particularly applying the philosophy of fearlessness, which is my thing. Well, I basically am going to say out front, the young man shows me in all his actions exactly my definition of bravery, and bravery as distinct from courage or courageousness, and to the further deeper levels of maturity that I call fearless, fear-less, fearlessness, and fearless, the highest form of maturity on this scale of responding to fear. Okay, so that was what that was, a scale of responding to fear or fear responses. On the side of how to make fear useful, how to utilize it in a useful, transformative way to bring out higher virtues, as the Indigenous worldview, according to Four Arrows and many others, shows that that is a practice. By practicing good fear, responsivity management, call it what you will, is that it leads to highest virtues of courage and fearlessness. So what I saw in this young man was stepping up at one point. He just was part of the crowd. Then he stepped up at some point, confronted this Indigenous leader, elder, and persisted to look him in the eyes. And apparently they seem to both be looking each other in the eyes, but doing very different practices. One staying in silence, the young man. And the young man, again, with often grimaces of sort of jeering, kind of making fun of. And of course, the guys behind him are all doing that. You could sort of see the great fun they had in making fun of another, and a scene of pretty disrespectful encounter. However, one has to say, well, gee, that young man was pretty amazing for a 15, 16-year-old. And, we ought to respect how brave he was. He stood up, and of course, in his statement, the young man is now being interviewed, etc. He'll be quite famous over history, or at least short history, media history, cultural history. But he's quite famous for this great stand-up. And he basically showed me that, okay, he could keep restraint. He wasn't operating totally in an impulsive response. He was showing this kind of restraint of silence. And in his statement, he says he was in prayer for a better outcome. And being Christian, you'd expect he would say that. Of course, he's under a lot of pressure right now to say the right things. Who knows what is behind all those comments and PR firms that already have been hired to help him craft his story for big media. He stood there, and yeah, one would say that was impressive. And I would say it was impressive in a certain kind of way as well. On the other hand, what was very clear to me was its bravery and in its more twisted form of bravado, because it's conditioned. His fear response is conditioned, and this was a terrifying atmosphere. I think everybody would say that was there, more or less. It was pretty scary, the kind of potential for violence and outburst and that was going on. But he was conditioned by the environment, by his peers, and he knew he would be watched. He knew he would be photographed, and he was about to do a brave thing and get a lot of kudos from his pals behind him, and a lot of kudos from a lot of white males who are pretty angry right now and raging against. Again, this is the kind of Trumpian politics of anti-politically correct action, movements, values. So he knew he was going to score a lot of points. In the interview, which he had on MSN day or so after, it's interesting to watch how mild and meek he looks, and if not embarrassed. And all he sort of says is, well, I had a right to be there. But he says, I kind of wished we all would have turned around and gone back instead of taunted and played with the Indigenous people moving through that space. So why he didn't even achieve pure bravery in a good sense, a healthy sense, was because he was already being pushed into bravado, braggadocio, the very common problem we see in young people, and particularly young adrenaline-driven men who get into crowd behavior. And it's not all that impressive. And it's usually pretty violent in subtle ways. So he may claim, as he does, and others, that they weren't violent. And, well, violence has to be deconstructed into more subtle and more subtle and more subtle forms. And I can guarantee you it was a violent act of disrespect. And you don't have to step in front of an Indigenous elder leading some youth. You could have moved around, given them space, just like you would want space. And so there was a purposeful braggadocio, a kind of inflated male ego, which we might expect from a 16-year-old. But I also say, but hey, let's turn this into a really great learning event for everybody, including these young people, including young males, that, hey, braggadocio or bravery, even on the healthy side of bravery, there's at least 4 or 5 more stages of fear response that could be attained and learned about if we had a good fear education. So I don't blame this young guy. I don't blame all those young men, white young men, and the Trumpites, whatever we want to call them. It just shows me how uneducated the system is that educates them, including the Catholic Church, which knows better. So I would like to see some much better education come around this, much more discussion and talk about what's the nature of fear, terror that was going on, and how people all handled it, including the Indigenous side. And I did notice that the Indigenous elder really didn't talk about courage and fearlessness on his own part much. He, in some sense, seems not to have the full vocabulary of accessing, at least in the works, the media I saw. So again, a lot of us just don't have that kind of information that I'm offering here. And that's, again, nobody's fault. It's no blame. It's that we've got a long way to go. So from bravado, if you want to just follow a little bit here, I'll finish off the video now with just that schema, which I've repeated in many of my other videos. So there's out there if you want to watch on my YouTube channel. And I articulate this in more different ways and in more detail. So once we can even recover healthy bravery beyond the braggadocio or bravado kind of no fear, fearless, false no fear, false no fearless that goes with it, we can get to something called courage or courageousness, which would have been this young man being able to be part of that crowd, part of that energy, noticing what's going on in the environment. And if he had ever reached full courageousness, which I don't see, I think he'll start to touch on it now in his reflections and in his own self-critique as he reflects on this learning process. Apparently he even wants to meet with the Indigenous elder and vice versa. That would be interesting. Courageousness is much more internalized, so he could have reflected a lot more and said, what would it mean to be courageous in this situation I was in? How could he be morally courageous in, quote, doing the right thing? Not doing the adrenaline pump thing and all my peers pushing behind me and leading the troops, leading the football team, leading the crowd, leading the gang mentality that he got caught in. So I hope he admits that at some point. He can be a great teaching mentor for many young people on this topic. Whoa, that would be great. So I encourage you to do that, my friend. And with that self-reflection, he would have practiced courageousness and come to maybe a nuanced, maybe a more teaching, and maybe wouldn't have just kept his mouth shut and grinned and sneered and played out the role he played out for media, for his own self-esteem. So courageous is not about trying to raise your self-esteem in the light of the cultural, environmental condition or context. That's the big difference. And that's where we start to move to notions of fearless and fearlessness, which is even further down the road, and then fearless at the far end. Once you start moving away from courageousness, you start to be interested in and reflect upon and learn about and do your own healing and your own biases and your own fear and how it controls your life, which we don't know at this point how fear controls this young man's life before this incident or after. But fearless, fear-less, and fearlessness involve a great interest in understanding fear in all its ways, negative, positive, and it's not even negative, positive, is much more expansive than those two simple binary categories. But that if you're a Christian and you're attempting to follow the teachings of Jesus and love, God is love, certainly courageousness is not enough. Bravery certainly isn't enough. Bravado is actually the opposite direction and moving toward a very fear-based existence through its forms of violence, symbolically and otherwise, subtly and grossly, which is all part of racism, classism, all the big oppressions. So fearless starts to understand how much the world is controlled by fear-mongering, controlled by the very events that this young man was caught in. And if he was reflective at that level, which would have been impressive, which would have been outstanding, way beyond the norm, but which is very possible and very capable. We all are, more or less, to achieve these other levels of maturity in relationship to how fear, when it meets fearlessness, what can happen and what direction can we move? Going to move more in the fear-based way or going to more in the love-based way, which would be that path of these higher fear responses, these mature fear responses. More healing, more liberating. Understanding that context of the culture of fear. And this is what these young people are caught in. I feel for them. Who's helping them understand the culture of fear? I'm not talking about who's helping them understand, virtues and vices and sin and all those things. I mean, they're getting all that education. It's part of the religious education, but they're certainly, I can guarantee, not getting, as is nobody really, getting a good education on what is fear and what happens when fear meets fearlessness in human history. And how do they interact typically in this, quote, bravado, distorted, even pathological form of fear management, and an education that's very incomplete, biased, twisted, and poor choices are made. And again, this is what we need to be improving. So fearlessness, ultimately, where I sit and do my analysis, which I'm doing my fear analysis from right now, can be learned. It can be incorporated in our practices to be, quote, non-violent, even though that term I find somewhat a euphemism, a oxymoron. There's no way that we can practice full non-violence. We are so violent upon the earth in just about everything we do. Just about everything. I didn't say everything. The way we live in a modern, urban, very destructive worldview, very destructive technological world on other beings, and unsacred in so many ways, and so destructive, including the very highways that we drive on that continually snuff out life, and never mind the carbon dioxide abuses that we put into the atmosphere. So I don't even like to talk about nonviolence in some sense, but there is a movement towards less violence. And hey, let's go down there, I say. And there are ways. And so there's a path. There's this path of fearlessness. And that's where I'd like to really conclude with these young people, and all people, of course. The adults that supposedly are supposed to be the role models for young people. I'd like to see them step up. And let's start having a different conversation about what happens when fear meets fearlessness. I do believe the Indigenous elder represented everything that is to do with fearlessness in its most mature form. Whether he personally, was dealing with fear or it was affecting him in certain ways, what I observed in the singing of the song he chose to sing and the way he handled the eye-to-eye contact, etc., I see a lot of, not all full, but a lot of the fearlessness modality of response, and something really important to be learned there from the Indigenous teaching. And thank you very much for that, elder, and thank you very much even for the young person for playing out this great drama for us all to learn from. And I look forward to more conversations on this, and I like to see the wisdom and compassion of the whole event, the whole drama, brought out more and more as we come to understand more about fear and how to manage that well. Okay, thanks a lot.